Okay, so today I'm here with Dr. Liz Jackson. So, Liz, if you just want to briefly introduce yourself, just give a background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did my PhD in philosophy at Notre Dame. I graduated from there in 2019. I did a year-long postdoc in Australia, although that was interrupted by pandemic and fires and a lot of crazy things going on in the world. And I actually am just about to start my second year at Ryerson University. So Ryerson is a school in Toronto, and I'm an assistant professor of philosophy there. So I teach a lot of classes in epistemology, and I also teach critical thinking. So my two kind of main areas of interest for research are epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and rational belief. So I'm interested in questions like what should we believe, what factors affect rational belief. Also interested in, my dissertation was on the relationship between belief and what you might call, so it's like kind of like a confidence level. Philosophers often call it credence. You can think about it sort of like a subjective probability or a confidence level. So that was my dissertation topic, but I'm interested in a bunch of things in epistemology in general. And then I'm also interested in philosophy of religion, and most of my research there is on the rationality of religious commitment. So I'm interested in faith. What is faith? Whether faith could be rational, the relationship between faith and hope. We're going to maybe talk about that a little bit today. But then my other big area of interest is kind of the main thing we're going to talk about today, which is Pascal's wager.
Yes, great. That was a great introduction.
Awesome.
Okay, so we're just going to get right into it. What is Pascal's wager?
Yeah, so Pascal's wager is an argument that you should believe in God, or that you ought to believe in God. And it basically says, like, you just got to look at sort of a cost benefit analysis. And you can cash this out in different ways. I often cash it out using something like decision theory, which is like a method that economists and philosophers use to figure out what to do. But I think you can just kind of put it in pretty simple terms. And it basically just goes like this. So if I believe in God and God exists, things will be really good for me. I'll get to have a relationship with God. I'll get to go to heaven. Arguably, that's even infinitely good. So believe in God, God exists, infinitely good outcome. If I don't believe in God and God exists, you can have different theologies about what happens, but some people would say you cease to exist. Others would say you even go to hell. So it could be an outcome that's either like much worse than going to heaven, which would be annihilated, or even like infinitely bad if you go to hell. So things look pretty bad if you don't believe in God and God exists. And then if God doesn't exist, the thought is, well, no matter what you do, whether you believe in God or don't believe in God, whatever you gain or lose would be finite. So you might have some gains associated with either action. Maybe there are certain benefits to believing in God, or maybe believing in God is really annoying because you have to go to church and make these sacrifices. We can debate about that, but ultimately it doesn't really matter because either way it's finite. So kind of just given this really basic setup, it looks like it's a much better option to believe in God than to not believe in God.
Okay. So, question two, what is the distinction between the pragmatic approach and the epistemic approach in Pascal's wager?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this actually just also helps kind of understanding what the wager is.
Right.
And so you can think about arguments for theism, or arguments sort of related to the topic of God's existence, and sort of these two categories. The first is what you might call an epistemic argument. What an epistemic argument does is it basically aims to raise the probability that God exists, give you evidence that God exists, and the conclusion of a lot of these arguments is just God exists. So you could think about, the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, fine-tuning argument. A lot of the traditional theistic arguments fall in this category. And what they're doing is they're making a claim about the world. They're saying the world is such that God exists, or this thing is true in the world. There's a God, So let's contrast that with this other category of arguments, and arguably Pascal's wager, it falls in the second category, and that would be a pragmatic argument. So instead of giving arguments that raise the probability for God's existence, pragmatic arguments focus on the benefits of believing in God. So instead of concluding God exists, pragmatic arguments conclude that you should believe in God. So they don't make a claim about the world, or they don't say this is true in the world, like God exists. Instead, they're making a claim about what you should do, namely that you should believe in God.
Like the action.
Exactly.
Right, the actions,
or act. And we're going to talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
So, in a way, pragmatic arguments are weaker because they don't require the same level of evidence. They're not necessarily trying to give you a bunch of evidence that God exists. But in another way, you could also see them as being stronger because they're saying rationally, you need to do this thing. This is something you ought to do. Whereas if all you're saying that God exists, that doesn't automatically mean rationality requires X, Y, Z. It's not a claim about what you should do. It's a claim about the world. So they're different claims, but I don't necessarily see one as like overall stronger. It's just a different kind of claim.
Yeah, the pragmatic approach seems really interesting too, because, just say we're talking about natural theology. We could talk about contingency arguments, ontological arguments, any kind of argument for God's existence. It's interesting, and you can establish a lot from that, but it's not really going to get you anywhere. It's not really going to change you as an individual, so that pragmatic approach seems to be really interesting in that action over just mere belief.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I do wonder, Pascal's wager, I don't know, you've probably seen this, but people on the internet, on Twitter, especially, like they just hate it,
Yeah,
it makes them really mad.
They get really angry. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder if this is part of the reason why, because in a way it is this kind of stronger claim. Yeah. So I don't know, we can speculate about the sociology of people on social media for a long time, but I've wondered if this might partially explain why it seems like they hate Pascal's wager more than the other arguments.
Yeah, and I think there's more to it, obviously. It's just on the face, I'm going to get sent to hell, or should I believe, should I not believe? And maybe that draws the negative reaction, but so this kind of segues into our third question. Another way to look at the wager is action over belief, and you kind of touched upon that, but if you have anything more to add to that.
Yeah. So I guess when I was kind of originally framing the wager, and maybe I should say too, I was kind of giving a really simplistic version of the wager, but there's a lot of like more nuanced versions. And then arguably even Pascal himself actually didn't frame the wager in terms of what we should believe. And so you can talk about what we should believe. And I think there's interesting versions of the wager that do focus on belief. So I don't want to throw belief out altogether.
Right.
But I think another really interesting version of Pascal's wager kind of pulls us away from focusing solely on belief and instead makes the wager about action. And one way I like to think about it is it's about like a commitment to God. And so what Pascal said is like, look, if you can't just make yourself believe, then go to mass, take holy water. That's kind of how he put it. But you can think about it even more generally than that. The wager gives you a reason to sort of pursue a relationship with God, whether or not you believe that God exists, but pursue a relationship with God if God exists. So read scripture and pray and go to church and immerse yourself in a religious community. So the wager gives you a reason for commitment rather than belief. So you can kind of frame it either way.
Right.
Yeah.
So question 4, can you address the many gods objections? So, just take Islam and Christianity. Both religions posit different things, right? They both posit this hell. So if Christians wager on the Christian God, but not the, God of Islam, well, we're in pretty big trouble, and vice versa. So how would you address that?
Yeah, that's a good question, partially just because this is one of the most common things that you hear, online. And also, too, like when you talk about Pascal's wager in like a philosophy class, a lot of students bring this up.
And it's very intuitive, this notion of religious pluralism. I think it is a good objection.
I agree. And it's not, my response to this objection is not just to dismiss it or say it's stupid.
Yeah, right.
So, maybe I should clarify that. I do think this is a good objection.
Yeah.
I just think it's it's brought up a lot.
Right.
So anyway, yeah. So I guess here's my response to the many gods objection. And the most like simplistic way of putting the response is this, is that probabilities matter. And some people think that once we bring infinities in, probabilities just don't matter anymore. So we can like, and there's ways of framing the wager where this happens. It's like, it doesn't matter what you think the probability of God's existence is at all. That really doesn't matter, because look, this infinity is just swamping everything. And so you can take that and get this result that probabilities don't matter at all. You can like take that too far, Yeah. And I'm thinking, look, probabilities matter, and probabilities are, in my view, one of the best ways to help us decide how to choose between these various religions.
It's the only way we really can at the end of the day. What's inductively stronger.
Yeah. And so it's like, and the religions that are going to be important are the ones that have this infinite afterlife. So that infinite afterlives do play a role here. But kind of beyond that, probabilities are going to be one of the most important ways to choose between afterlives. So earlier we were sort of talking about, epistemic arguments versus pragmatic arguments. And I think what this shows is that it's not like the epistemic stuff is totally irrelevant to the pragmatic arguments. We're not throwing that out, but it plays a role along with these considerations about value. So it's kind of like a both and, but value plays this really important role as well. And so I often give this sort of thought experiment to illustrate why we shouldn't just throw epistemology out the window. You're given the choice between a 90% chance at an infinite good and a 10% chance at an infinite good, right? So clearly you shouldn't say, well, they're both infinite, so I should just flip a coin. Like that just makes no sense. No. Epistemology matters. So take the 90% chance, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when we apply this sort of intuitive idea to Pascal's wager, what we get is the result that you should wager for the religion that's most likely to be true. And so, Christianity and Islam, they're not the same in every respect here, because when you wager on whichever one's most probable, that gives you this higher chance at getting the infinite good. So it's like similar, like maybe Christianity is like, if you think it's like 70% likely and Islam is like 20% likely or whatever, it's kind of like that thought experiment. It's like 70 versus 20. Clearly you want to go for the 70% chance at getting the infinite good rather than the 20% chance.
Yeah, that makes sense. The epistemic part certainly matters. We don't want to throw that away.
Yep. And so, can I say one last thing?
Oh, yeah. No, you can't.
And so, no. And so one thing, I guess there's two things that a lot of people say in response. One is like, how do we know which religion's most likely? And the answer there is look at the evidence, look at the evidence for and against various religions.
That's all you can do.
So I think that, there has been arguments given for Christianity, but also for Islam and also for other religions. And so you just need to look at that evidence and make a judgment. Part of at least my version of the wager isn't arguing that Christianity is the most probable. That's not what we do in our version, but there are people that do that. They try to argue for, a various religion being more likely, but that's not part of our wager. But the other thing that people say is, what's the point of Pascal's wager if you're just wagering for the religion that's most likely to be true? Like, what is that? What is the pragmatic aspect of that? And here's why it is interesting and controversial. It's very unlikely that atheists go to heaven and theists go to hell. Most people would agree with that. And because people even laugh at that. They're like, why would you even, that's crazy. Right. Yeah. Right. But at least we can just say it's unlikely. And because that's unlikely, Pascal's wager means that it's irrational to be an atheist or an agnostic. So even if the wager doesn't tell you which religion to pick, it basically says being an atheist and being an agnostic, that's irrational. And so I think that's really controversial. That's a huge conclusion. And even though it doesn't tell you which religion to pick, I still think it's still really controversial. So
certainly.
Throw that in there. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. So question 5, what is the impossibility objection? So since we cannot be sure for certain that God exists due to this epistemic gap, can we really wager on this in any fair sense? And can we really wager on things just based on mere benefits.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so a lot of people will sort of motivate this objection and say, look, let's say I gave you $1 million to believe 1 + 1 = 3, and you really do care more about the money than you care about having the true belief. Like maybe you're just broke and $1 million would be a game changer for you. It still doesn't seem like you could just form that belief for the money. At least a lot of people have that intuition that they couldn't do that. And so, and I think this points to kind of a more general thing, which is that most philosophers reject this view that's called doxastic voluntarism. Doxastic just means having to do with beliefs. Voluntarism is voluntary or whatever. So the view is that you have voluntary control over your beliefs. And it is true that most philosophers reject that. So I'm actually not like most philosophers in this respect. So I think, yes, in this case where the case is 1 + 1 = 3. That's the thing you're trying to believe. You probably don't have control over that belief, right? But I think it would be just an overgeneralization or deriving a general principle from just a case or two to say that automatically entails we don't have any kind of control over any of our beliefs. So the cases that I think are interesting to think about are cases that you're really torn about what to believe, or the thing the issue that you're thinking about isn't obviously true or false. And so you might, I could try to come up with like a non-religious example. You might be trying to decide like who to vote for or something, and you might be really torn between two candidates.
That's good.
It's like, it's like that case isn't one where, at least it's not as obvious that you don't have some level of control. You can't choose to say, I believe this is the best candidate. And I think God's existence, so this is controversial too, but God's existence is an issue where I think there's good evidence on both sides. I think, there's interesting arguments for the existence of God, ones that have gotten lots of attention and are plausible in many ways. But there's also the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness and some really interesting arguments for atheism as well. And I think it's foolish to just say, no, the evidence is just clearly should make us all 100% confident that God exists.
It's irrefutable.
It's like, and I think there might be, we can talk about different ways that the evidence might support theism over atheism, maybe if people just aren't always aware of that. There's a lot of debate to be had here, but I think there's good arguments on both sides, and I think it's okay for a theist to admit that, right?
For sure.
And so because of that, I think that the existence of God is a matter that we might have more control over because it's different than 1 + 1 = 3. It's not obviously true or false. I think it's a question that I think we could have a lot more control over because it's not one of these propositions that's just obviously true or obviously false. And on this note too, so there's different kinds of control that we could have over things. One kind of control we could have is the control we have over raising our hand. Like you can just do it immediately and quickly. It's not something that it's just like a very quick process. Some people call this a basic action.
Right.
But basic actions, these things we just have this direct and immediate control over, that's not the only kind of voluntary control. I also have control over whether I write a paper in the next month. I have control over whether I work out later or what I cook for dinner. But these aren't things I can just do in like this flash of like lightning. Like it's not just this, it's these things that happen over time. And so you might have an indirect but still voluntary control over your belief in God. So, you can change your political beliefs by changing the news sources you read. You can change your fitness level by choosing to work out more, even though you can't change these things immediately. And so, your belief about God's existence could be like that. Could be something that even if you can't change directly, you still have more control over than like 1 + 1 = 3 or something.
Right.
So
that's great.
That's kind of the first response. Sorry. Yeah. Did you want to add something or say something?
Oh, no, you're good. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. And then the second response, I can just say much more briefly because we've kind of already talked about it. But if you make the wager about a commitment to God, so about acting in certain ways, going to church, praying, putting yourself in a religious community, then this objection doesn't even really come up, right? Because you clearly have control over that. That you can clearly control whether you go to church or pray or read scripture or, you know, follow the moral commands of a religion or whatever. So if you go in for the action or commitment version of the wager, then this objection doesn't really come up. So that's the kind of response number 2.
Right. Okay. So question 6, what is the irrationality objection? So this seems to kind of ignore evidentialism, you know, that we proportion our beliefs to the evidence. And let me see the other note I have here. So yeah, I mean, if we're merely believing in God off of some infinite good or a fear of eternal punishment, it seems kind of like coercion or an insult to reason itself.
Yeah.
So how would you address that?
Yeah, no, I think this is good. So evidentialism is a very common view among philosophers, and it seems like Pascal's wager is sort of pushing us to believe in God because of some benefit. Again, I even defined it that way, really. It's not about giving us evidence. It's about looking at kind of some kind of cost benefit analysis.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is an interesting objection. And also note too, even if we can control our belief in God, that doesn't guarantee that whatever we have control over results in a rational belief, right? So I might be able to force myself into believing in God, but it still seems like there's a problem if that belief turns out to be irrational in some way. Right. So yeah, so this is a nice objection. I think there's 2 main responses to it. So I talked about, and actually in some ways it relates to the responses we just talked about, but they're slightly different. So you know, there's these cases where it really seems like a belief is clearly rational or clearly irrational. So like 1 + 1 = 3, again, clearly irrational. 1 + 1 = 2, clearly rational. So sometimes beliefs are just, it's very obvious that we have evidence that just like really decisively supports it or really decisively supports it's the opposite of it, that it's false, you know. Mm-hmm. But again, it doesn't seem like God's existence is falling in this category. It's not like all atheists are just clearly, obviously irrational, but it's also not like all theists are just clearly, obviously irrational. And so some people have argued that this is a case where people can be rational as a theist or an agnostic or an atheist. And that's because our evidence it's difficult to evaluate. There's good evidence on both sides. And it's complicated and it's not clear that it just supports one position. Mm-hmm. So if our evidence, you know, so evidentialism is this view, we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence. We should believe what the evidence supports. But this might be a case where the evidence actually supports multiple attitudes. It could be a case where the evidence supports belief, agnosticism, and disbelief. Or maybe for some people, the evidence supports, you know, just belief or agnosticism or just disbelief or agnosticism. So we can take each case individually. But if you're in a case where theism is one of the attitudes supported by your evidence, and you do at least have some evidence that supports theism, then you can take Pascal's wager and still respect evidentialism because multiple attitudes fit your evidence. And that's so I actually think, I actually think even if you're motivated to believe in part for practical reasons, this is a case where there's like an epistemic tie, and then the practical reason breaks the tie.
Yeah.
So this, to me, it's like, I just don't see a conflict. I think you can be an evidentialist and still take Pascal's wager.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, proportioning your beliefs to the evidence, that can be a bit ambiguous. I mean, we have to be careful about how we unpack that, because if that's just the case, then why is everyone not an atheist or a theist or an agnostic? I mean, these attitudes do differ, like you mentioned.
Totally. So I think probably the best objection to this is like, and it's not even, I don't think it's a totally an objection, but it's just saying it doesn't apply to every case. So what about the person who just their evidence, like for whatever reason, just really strongly seems to support atheism? Maybe they just, I don't know, maybe they're not aware of arguments for God's existence, or maybe they've just had some really intense experiences of evil. But, in theory, I don't want to say there can't be people that really their evidence seems to support atheism. So being a theist would be irrational given their evidence. And here, again, this is like paralleling what we just talked about in the previous objection. But I think here we can make the wager about a commitment to God rather than about something you believe or don't believe. And so evidentialism is a theory about what we should believe. It's not a theory about action. And so again, you can take Pascal's wager without violating evidentialism because it's the wagers about how you act, not what you should or shouldn't believe.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, so question 7. Let's talk about faith. Like, what is faith? And then we can kind of tie it into the wager. So what would you say faith is?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think you can actually sort of, this is becoming a theme of this interview, maybe without either us intending it to, but maybe it's my fault. But you can actually understand faith in the two ways we've been talking about. So faith as something like belief, or a mental state at least like belief, something kind of that's in your head. Mm-hmm. Or you can also understand faith as an action. So you could, like, people say, take a leap of faith. Faith is this thing you do when you trust, like someone will catch you and you do a trust fall, or, whatever. You could take a leap of faith. So I think what's cool about faith in Pascal's wager is that this actually kind of parallels the two ways of taking Pascal's wager that we've been talking about. One is this mental state that you have, and faith as a mental state at least involves two things. The first is something kind of like a belief-like component. There's a big debate about whether it requires a full-on belief or maybe just like some confidence level or thinking the evidence, at least sort of supports something or whatever. So but it's a belief-like component. You can spell it out in different ways. Mm-hmm. And then the second component of faith is a desire-like component. So it would be weird to say, like, I have faith you'll win your upcoming basketball game, but I really hope you lose. It's like, no, faith involves this desire or thinking this would be good.
This trust as well.
Yeah. Yep. And I think I am totally happy with views that say faith is a kind of trust.
And everyone has faith as well. Mm-hmm. Albert Einstein, for example, said he cannot imagine any scientist without the most profound faith. Faith is really entrenched in all of our convictions.
I totally agree. I feel like people associate faith with just this religious thing. And I think that's just not the best way to think about it. You have faith in your spouse and faith in your friends and faith in recycling or the Constitution or you name it, what your favorite political view. You have faith in so many different things, whether you're religious or not. And I actually really don't like it when you'll see this, like people will say, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I don't like it when people say that because it's
Frank Turek says that, I think.
And I think that's really harmful. Isn't that the title of his book?
It's literally the title of his book. I don't. Okay,
I knew it was a book. But the problem is that what you're doing is you're conceding that faith is this bad thing. Faith is this believing without evidence, or believing something is false, and I just think that's not the way I like to think about faith. I like to think about faith as a thing that helps us maintain our commitments. And because of that, it can help us persist in a commitment even when we get counter evidence. But that's very different than saying faith is believing without evidence or believing something isn't true. So So I don't like that book title. That's just not what faith is.
Right, exactly. And let me see here. The way I think of faith too is when you have all this evidence, right? And you get to the very edge of knowledge. Not that we can get to the very edge of knowledge, but you get to the edge of some kind of proposition and you put your faith in that proposition, right? Everything we believe, we have faith that we believe it. We presuppose a ton of things, So this notion of blind faith is just, it's no good.
I agree. So I think, and I think there's a distinction between saying faith could, in some sense, go beyond the evidence to a point, and saying that faith is just ignoring evidence or something.
Right.
So yeah, I think we can say like faith has this unique relationship with evidence without saying they're just totally opposed to each other. I don't like that idea. So,
right. And real quick, Liz, I have, are you familiar with Bishop Barron?
Yeah, I am.
I heard him on Cosmic Skeptics podcast, and he kind of defined faith like this isn't his exact words. I kind of formulated it differently, but you know, imagine you meet a woman for the first time, you know absolutely nothing about her, right? But gradually you begin to know her better and better. And over time, you pretty much know all there is to know, but not everything. And at this point, she's revealing all kinds of things about herself to you. So would you believe her? Or would you think she's misguiding you or lying? Probably not. You would place trust in her. And I just thought that was really great, because that's kind of how faith works. You have trust in this, and you begin to believe this, but it's predicated on reasonable grounds. You're not just believing blindly, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like it reveals itself over time. You know,
yep.
And you place faith in that.
Totally. And sometimes having faith or taking an act of faith, like you said, then can reveal additional evidence, but you couldn't have had that evidence if you didn't take that act of faith.
Exactly.
I think religious faith can definitely be like this. So,
right.
Yeah. So did you want me to kind of tie it into the Pascal's wager stuff?
If you want, like briefly, I mean, I think we've kind of touched on it, but whatever you want.
Yeah, sure. Well, okay. I'll just say quickly. So kind of what we've been getting at with faith is I think faith can be rational even in the face of doubt or counter evidence. Again, it's not this thing that's like believing without evidence, but faith can help you. Like even that example that you just gave, you don't have full and complete evidence that this person is trustworthy or this person, she's a good person or whatever.
Yeah.
But and then you might even get to a situation where you have doubts about her, but faith can help you sort of persist in your friendship or whatever kind of relationship you have with her. And I think that's true for a lot of things, both relationships, but even also other kind of commitments to ideals that we might have. Stuff
exactly.
Like that.
Yeah.
And this is actually in some ways really related to what is going on in cases of taking Pascal's wager, because the point of Pascal's wager is that it can be rational to make this commitment to God, even if you have a lot of doubts about whether God exists, even if you think the probability that God exists is like relatively low or somewhere in the 0.5 range, but it's saying like you don't have to have this like 99% chance that theism is true to be rational. And, I think in both cases, part of what motivates you is this consideration about value or this pragmatic thing. Like faith, I said, involves a desire. Part of what motivates you to persist in your commitments is like, how good would it be if I continued in this commitment and this person was trustworthy, or I continued to get this degree and I'm cut out for it or whatever. And in the same way, Pascal's wager is like, how good would it be if I made this commitment to God and continued in that commitment and God did exist? So in both cases, you're kind of motivated to continue, not just because of epistemic stuff, but because of these practical or desire-based reasoning. So I won't, I'll leave it there. But the point is, I think actually faith and Pascal's wager have quite a bit in common. And I actually have a paper, it's called Faithfully Taking Pascal's Wager, where I spell all this out in more detail. So people can check that out if they're more interested in that. That was a brief summary. Yeah.
Sounds interesting. So question 8, how does Pascal's wager show that atheism is irrational? And we kind of did touch upon this as well. If you have anything else to add, or we just move on to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just kind of reiterate, like, to show that atheism is irrational, you need a pretty weak premise, which is that it's more likely that theists go to heaven than that atheists do, which is like a very weak premise. I mean, so notice I didn't mention anything about hell. I didn't say that it's guaranteed that atheists don't go to heaven. It's just that it's more likely that theists go to heaven than that atheists do. And so if you agree with that, then based on just kind of the tools we talked about earlier, whether that's decision theory or some kind of cost benefit analysis, Pascal's wager shows that atheism is irrational. There are some, there's ways you can potentially get around this with certain, like if you think, so like Christianity and Islam, if you see atheists as like this neutral party, but maybe if you practice Christianity and Islam is true, then you go to like the deepest level of hell, and maybe vice versa or something. There's ways you can kind of like try to set things up so the way that heaven and hell, maybe atheists are annihilated, but if you pick the wrong religion, you're in the deepest level of hell. You can try to set things up so you get atheism not to be obviously irrational, and there are ways to do that. But then again, I think you're kind of challenging this idea that it's more likely that theists go to heaven than atheists, because this is saying there's this huge risk to picking the wrong religion,
Yeah.
So the point is that you can have these very specific theologies, which I think themselves are very like highly questionable. Like, it's not clear to me that atheists are just neutral and that practicing the wrong religion is really what's going to get you,
Yeah.
But I really think it kind of comes down to this pretty simple claim that it's more likely that theists go to heaven than atheists. So, yeah.
This is slightly off topic, but something you said made me think about this. What do you think about atheists when they say, I just lack belief in God? I think that's kind of a problematic thing to say. I mean, they are ultimately, it's not really a lack of belief. I mean, they are rejecting the proposition that God exists.
Yeah, no,
I just find that odd.
I think it's a confused way that they're trying to relinquish themselves of the burden of proof. But I think it's problematic for so many reasons. So there's a show where Joe Schmidt and Cameron Bertuzzi, have you seen this one? And, yeah. And they're like the three biggest mistakes atheists make. And this is something that, I mean, so Joe does such a good job giving, like, he has like 27 reasons.
He's a smart guy.
He's very smart. Yeah.
Very smart guy.
But I think a couple things, I mean, I'll just mention two quick things. One, no atheist philosophers of religion, maybe like there's one that says this is my stipulative definition, but the overwhelming majority understand atheism to be the belief that God does not exist.
Right.
And this just fits with the way that epistemologists think about this as well. You have belief, you have withholding belief, and you have disbelief. And this applies to any statement, any proposition. You could think about the number of hairs on my head is even. I withhold belief on that. And if I went and counted them, I might either believe that that's true or believe that that's false. But every proposition, you can take these three attitudes towards it. And so when it comes to theism, it's like, look, theists believe that God exists. Agnostics withhold belief on whether God exists, and atheists believe that God does not exist.
Right.
So I mean, not only do philosophers of religion, atheists, theists, all of them basically just accept this framework, but it's just the framework that almost all I mean, it's like this fundamental commitment of epistemology. Yeah. So I think it's just this confused and in some ways, I don't even know. It just seems like a way they're trying to get out of the burden of proof. I don't.
I hear it all of the time. I mean, constantly. So you lack belief. So do you kind of believe in God? It's not. Or
like, are rocks atheists because they don't have beliefs? They all lack a belief. Like, it's like, it's just, no, I don't really like it. I don't want to say that it's always dishonest, but it does seem to come from this thing where they think that it'll get them out of the burden of proof, but it's not even clear to me that lacking belief gets someone out of the burden of proof. If you said, I lack belief that 1 + 1 = 2, I'd be like, dude, why? And like, I think that in that case, the burden of proof would be on you. So
right.
It's definitely something that bothers me. And it makes me wish that people on the internet would be paying more attention to what philosophers are saying. So.
Yeah, instead of the new atheists. Dawkins and whatnot. Okay, so we have two more questions left here. Since Pascal's wager is ultimately not an argument about God's existence, why should we wager on Christianity as opposed to some other religion?
So I think there's basically two reasons. I mean, I'll say first, I actually don't argue in my published work that we should wager for Christianity, but I'm wagering for Christianity, so I can definitely say something about this question, right? And I guess there's like two reasons. One is that what Pascal's wager is going to do is privilege the religions that have an infinite afterlife. Christianity has an infinite afterlife. Yes. So that's kind of the first component. And then the second component is something that you would need to give an argument for, but something that I think is true, which is that Christianity is the religion that is most likely to be true. So a few reasons to think this, but obviously I can't give, a full defense here.
No, that's
but
cool.
I'll just say a few things. I mean, and I'll say too, for me, I think religious experience is definitely a part of why I think Christianity is the most likely to be true. And I think religious experience is a legit epistemic source, and we could go into that. There's been books written on that, so we can talk more about that another time. But besides that, I think there's a couple arguments that I find really interesting. So the most common one is obviously the arguments based on the historical evidence for the resurrection. These are interesting. I think they're probably the one that gets the most attention in terms of, the arguments you'll hear for Christianity, and some people do like a minimal facts version of it, and there's different versions of it. Mike Rhoda actually has a really cool one in his book on Pascal's Wager. The book's called Taking Pascal's Wager. So I think those are interesting, at least part of the case for the truth of Christianity, that Jesus really did rise from the dead. Here's a second argument that someone, actually Apologetics Squared, has a YouTube channel, and we were talking at a conference recently, and he brought this argument up to me, and I thought it was really interesting. And so it requires you to buy part of the divine hiddenness argument, which is like, look, if God exists, then God would do everything in God's power to make sure there was as few non-believers as possible.
Non-resistant.
And exactly. And the non-believers that are there, it would be like their own fault or their own choosing that they didn't believe in God. And this is because God wants to have a relationship with everyone. And so if you think this is plausible, then I think actually this could give you an interesting argument for Christianity, because the majority of religion, Christianity is the biggest religion, and the majority of religious believers are Christian. And so it's like, look, if you buy this kind of divine hiddenness premise, then at least among the religions, it might give us a prima facie case that Christianity is most likely to be true, because there would be a certain amount of divine revelation to bring as many people as possible to see the truth of Christianity. Kind of an interesting argument. I mean, it's something, what I'm interested in is like giving arguments for Christianity that aren't just these resurrection arguments, because those have gotten so much attention. So this is kind of a second argument I thought was cool. And then I'll say very briefly, I think an argument just that appeals to the beauty of the incarnation and the atonement, I think is really interesting as well. You'd want some kind of premise that connects truth and beauty. So if, beautiful stories are more likely to be true or whatever, you could debate that, of course. But I personally think there's something really, really beautiful about the idea that God became a man and died in our place. And I think the Christian story is just this really awesome story. And I think given the right kind of bridge principle, that could be another additional reason to think that Christianity is most likely to be true. So there's just a couple brief thoughts. I know that was probably underdeveloped, but
no, that's cool. That's great.
Some reasons I think Christianity is most likely to be true.
For sure.
I did religious experience.
I did want to ask just real quick. For Pascal's wager, it would have to be the case that God would have to reveal himself, right? I mean, you could never use Pascal's wager on a deistic paradigm, right? It would have to be some kind of revelation in order to really even wager on anything, right?
Well, yeah. So you would want to think that the thing you were wagering on gave you a higher chance at an infinite afterlife or some kind of infinite good, I guess. Right. So I guess, I mean, deism, it would depend, but I don't know. Do deists believe in an afterlife?
That's true.
And at the very least, like, it seems like one of the goods I talk about a lot isn't just heaven, but this idea that you could have a relationship with God, this like personal connection to the all loving, all powerful creator of the universe. That's pretty dope. That's pretty awesome, it's like that, I think, wouldn't clearly be there on like a deistic picture. But you need some kind of story about the infinite good involved. And I think it's at least probably less plausible on deism than on more traditional
I don't know if deists believe in an afterlife. I mean, I know they think that God doesn't have any interaction with the world, but that could be another discussion.
I suppose you could probably go either way, but it would at least be more surprising on deism. Like why part of the afterlife is like getting to know God, and if God didn't really have an interest in us, then maybe the purpose would be less clear.
So rolling into the last question here, and it is divine hiddenness, and you kind of touched upon it a little bit, but this divine hiddenness objection that we are just not really sure. And to some people, we talked about non-resistant believers, it is not clear at all that God exists. And how does the wager account for this?
Yeah. So it's like, why would a all-loving God allow non-resistant non-belief? That's a really good way of summing up at least one of the really popular versions of divine hiddenness from J.L. Schellenberg, who's a philosopher actually in Canada. He works in Canada as well. Okay, so here's like what's kind of maybe behind that thought. And it's related to something we were actually talking about earlier as well. It's like the evidence for theism is, you might say, ambiguous or indecisive or something. And it seems like atheists, agnostics, and theists, they can all be epistemically irrational. So if we just stop there, that seems to motivate divine hiddenness, because it's like, look, why would God allow this person to be an epistemically rational atheist? If they don't believe in God through no fault of their own, that's at least a barrier to having a relationship with God. And an all-loving God would remove all barriers to relationship in the same way an all-loving parent would remove all barriers to relationship. So here's where I think Pascal's wager is really interesting, because if Pascal's wager is a successful argument, then it's not just about this epistemic thing. It's not just about whether there's evidence that supports atheism or good arguments for atheism or something. It's also about whether you've done your practical duties, whether you've paid attention to what's at stake with respect to either belief or action. And so if the wager is successful, then atheists and agnostics, they might be irrational in a non-epistemic sense, in a practical sense. And part of the thought behind that is like, look, the stakes around theism are super, super, super high. And it seems like the higher the stakes are, the more of a duty you have to look into something at the very least, or pursue something if there's some really good thing to be gained or some really bad thing to be lost, and you just kind of ignore that. It seems like the more to be gained or the more to be lost, the more we can kind of blame you for just ignoring that. It seems like on this picture, it's like maybe they've done their epistemic duties, but they haven't actually done their practical duties. And so there might actually be a lot less non-resistant non-belief than we might have thought if all we were considering was the epistemic. So when we consider both epistemic and practical duties, I think it, at the very least, gives us less non-resistant non-belief. And I actually think the amount of non-resistant non-belief matters. So if we had a world where there's like 3 non-resistant non-believers out of like billions of people, seems very different than a world where everyone but a few people is a non-resistant non-believer, I think it's kind of like how people used to frame the problem of evil like as a logical problem of evil, and then they made it evidential. I think we can do the same thing with hiddenness. If there's a lot less non-resistant non-believers, then either we might say, well, are those people actually non-resistant non-believers as well? So we could more easily drive it down to 0. Or we could say there's some greater good that justifies this non-resistant non-belief, but that good might not justify way more non-resistant non-belief.
Yeah. That makes sense. So you're kind of saying that, if I understood correctly, the practical approach is really important to be added to the other stuff, right?
Yeah.
So we don't just want this epistemic belief. We want this practical and this action. And that could make people maybe believers. Is that kind of what you're getting at? If they added that action to their, non-resistant belief.
So either we frame Pascal's wager as a reason to believe, the belief-oriented wager like we've been talking about, and then it kind of straightforwardly applies. Or even if we frame it in terms of action, I think it's plausible that action, well, one of two things. I mean, it could lead to a belief in God, right?
Yeah.
But what's the whole reason we cared about belief in the first place? It was because of this relationship, because of the good of being in relationship with God. And one super interesting thing that some people have talked about in the hiddenness literature is the possibility of being in a relationship with someone, and even a good relationship where you have a lot of benefits, but you either aren't sure that they actually exist, or maybe you believe in them, but under some other name. So like, in the Superman movies where, Spider-Man, the one where she has a relationship with what's Spider-Man's Peter
Mm,
Parker?
I
Peter,
think
sorry.
yeah, I
I'm
haven't
really bad.
watched it in quite a while.
So it's like, I forget, I haven't watched it in a while either, so I'm butchering this example, but she has a relationship with Peter Parker. And she also does have a relationship with Spider-Man. She just doesn't know it. And so it could be that, people have said like you're pursuing ultimate goodness, or you're pursuing the source of all truth and knowledge, and you don't actually know that you're also pursuing a relationship with God, but that's what you're in fact doing.
Right.
And so, I mean, I'm sure people have different views on how to spell this out, but the point is just that you might not either need a belief in God at all, or you might not need like an explicit belief that this being is God, that's omnipotent and omniscient and whatever, in order to have a relationship with God and glean the benefits of that relationship. So I think there's a couple different ways of going here.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So that's it. We did it.
Woohoo!
Liz, thanks so much for joining. I had a great time, and hopefully we can speak again soon.
Yeah, this was a super fun discussion, and thanks for giving me your time and all the awesome questions. And yeah, this was great. So
cool. All right, Liz, take care. Thanks so much.
Thanks.